Okay. If someone could please put in the chat whether you can see the presentation or not. Okay, thank you. I don't know what happened last time. That was just crazy. So I'm sorry to waste so much of your time. And I'm sorry for the repeat of what you saw up to putting in the hymn, but I'm going to repeat the whole thing so that we have a complete recording so that you have the recording. For those of you that missed my first presentation today, we lost the video and I couldn't figure out how to get it back. So we're re-recording. And welcome to class. I'm Susan Woodcock. And this is Blackout and Interlined Roman Shade with Ribs. So we're going to be making this shade, which is in my office. I absolutely love this shade. And it's on the Woodcock 2012 lip system. No pinholes of light. Has interlining and black outlining. So, and I'll try to remember the questions that were asked when I was doing the class earlier today to include that in the class as we're going along in the recording. So this class, you will make or learn how to make a Roman shade with black outlining, interlining, and ribs. This is a new method that I'm using, and it uses sleeves or casings, or you might call them pockets, made from blackout fabric. The rib sleeves are sewn using a two-step process that eliminates pinholes of light. The shade shown in class is reverse mounted on the Woodcock 2012 lift system with a cordless hand crank operation and a matching balance, which we'll do in the last class, covers up the lift system because the shade is falling off the back of the headrail. So in today's class, you'll learn all about pre-planning. And that includes seams and pattern matching and your shade folds and your columns of rings and cutting and adding the inner lining and the rib sleeves and ribs. Then next week, we'll add the black outlining, finish the hems, the shroud tape and rings, and adding the Velcro for the eyelets. And I'm still getting messages from people saying that the recording didn't work. So, and then we, in session 3, will wrap up with attaching the shade to the lift system, making that balance, installation, pricing, and time studies. I encourage you to make a sample. I have a small sample. I've got it here on the work table. There's a lot of value in having a small sample like that. You can make it while you're watching the class. If you have some scraps of ribs, you can use, and scraps of lining and face fabric. And it can be partially completed. It doesn't have to be a finished sample, but you can put that with your class handout. And then next year, when you get around to trying this method, you will have that to jog your memory, to have that partially completed sample. And you'll also have the class recordings. You may have heard the news. On Monday, the Consumer Product Safety Commission had their final ruling published for the safety standard for operating cords on custom window coverings. And they gave a 180-day effective date, which would be May 30th, 2023 for compliance. The Window Coverings Manufacturers Association today filed a lawsuit against CPSC saying that the time is too short. Who knows what'll happen? I'm going forward as if the effective date is May 30th, 2023. So what does this ruling mean for you? It means that operating cords on the sides of window coverings are eliminated. This includes B-chain loops that are installed with a tension device. It includes cord locks and cord cleats. Any cord, that you're going to be operating the shade with is affected by the standard. There are limits for retractable cords and free hanging cords. And that is still trying to understand that exactly. But I think we will be able to use retractable cords, and there's certainly rigid cord shrouds that can be used for bead chain loops. And we'll be seeing a lot more innovation with that. The system shown in this class uses a cord-free operation. So at Workroom Tech, we are going to be retrofitting all of our Roman shades on display to eliminate operating cords, or making the operating cord compliant with something like a rigid cord shroud. And all of our classes from now on, including this one, will have a cordless operating systems. I'm also going to have shades independently tested to make sure that the methods that we're teaching here are compliant. And the only way to know that is to send them off and have them follow the testing procedure. I will do that as soon as they have the testing procedures. I'm waiting to hear back. Last I know, they were still working on them. So once I have the testing procedures, I'll make my shades, send them off, and then I can report back to you. And I should have results in January and February, I hope. So look for the details on that on our blog and podcast, 30 Minutes with Workroom Tech, which you can find on our website under the tab that says blog and podcast. And I know it sounds challenging, and people are saying, well, I'm just going to close my business because I can't make shades. You can make shades. Everybody's going to have to follow the same rules. And from springs to motorization to manual operating systems, there's a lot of choices for operating systems. And I'll share that with you here. So here's a list of operating systems, and this is off the top of my head. There might be more. This does not include things from like Hunter Douglas for hard treatments. So there's the Bond spring system, Coulisse spring and motor, and possibly the Coulisse twin pull. I don't know yet. I haven't had that tested. That could be retrofitted. Dufix Noso has 2 cordless systems. Forest has spring and motor system. Rolle's Acmeda has spring and motor systems. Rolle Company has spring and motor systems. Safety Shade has spring and motor systems. They also have the wideband lift sheet and the fashion wand for the bead chain. And Vaco has hand crank and motors and spring systems. And don't forget, you can make stationary shades. My friend Rosemarie Garner makes beautiful Roman shades, and many of them are not functioning shades. They're stationary shades. She works with the interior designer that uses like solar shades and roller shades underneath these gorgeous, perfect Roman shade, stationary Roman shades. So don't forget about that. You can do that too. You could have Roman shades that are stationary with cafe curtains. So we will still be making Roman shades, and there will be a lot of innovation coming down the pike. I guarantee you that. So I'm going to try to check the questions, and hopefully I don't have the same trouble I had last time. So Lisa's saying that she saw that a lawsuit had been filed. Yes, the Window Coverings Manufacturers Association, which has been doing the voluntary standard since 1996 or something. They did file a lawsuit about the time frame. I spoke in the hearing earlier this year in May, during the CPSC hearing for public comments. And I spoke, and the one thing I said was, we need more time. 180 days doesn't give time for manufacturers and workrooms to retrain, to learn new systems, to innovate new systems and operating systems. They didn't do that, and gave us 6 months. So I don't know what will happen with the WCMA lawsuit. I'm not involved in that. I'm moving ahead as if we're going to have this change effective in May. So for the shade we're making in class, it's 64 inches wide by 54 1/4 inches long, inside mount. I have 2.5 inches of space, which is great because that's the size of my head rail. The face fabric is Cowtan and Tau, Althea linen. The lift system is Vaco 2012. The shade will be reverse mounted with a valance. And see page 1 of your handout for the list of all the supplies that go into making the shade. To quote yardage, to get a general figure, you will need to allow 8 inches for your side hems and your finished length by your bottom hem allowance. You will not have an allowance. You don't need an allowance at the top because it's going to be flush with the top of the back of the head rail. It's going to be Velcroed onto the back of the head rail. So you really don't need any extra for board mounting. So the bottom hem is going to be half of whatever your ring spacing is. And to figure that, we need to figure that in order to know what to allow. So for quoting purposes, add 8 inches. So 8 inches to your finished width, 8 inches to your finished length to figure out your yardage. To figure the vertical ring spacing, subtract the head rail allowance from your finished length and divide by an odd number. The head rail I'm using has a wand or a baton or a rod, crank rod attachment, and that's a Velcro attachment underneath of the head rail itself. And you can see that in the photo. And it's 4 and something inches. I rounded up to 5. So that's my head rail allowance. So 52 1/4 inches long, minus 5 inches for the head rail, divided by an odd number. So that could be 5, 7, 9. So 7 works out perfectly, 6.75 inches. You cannot exceed 8 inches to meet the cord safety standards between your rings and cord shroud. So I'm going with 6 3/4 inches between the rings. So that will be my hem allowance, and my hem will be double folded. So the finished hem will be 3.375. Now there's a typo in the screen on the screen. It's not in your handout, but that next line right here should say 6.75, not 6.67. So 6 3/4 plus half is going to the top. So that's why you divide by an odd number. Half's going to the below the ring on the hem, and the other half's going above the top ring added to the top space. And so that'll give me just over 10 inches from the top of the shade for that uppermost top ring. And now I can figure my cut size because I know the size of my finished hem. So it's the finished width plus 8 inches. I'm using 2-inch doubled side hems by the finished length plus my hem allowance of 6 3/4 inches. So I need to cut the fabric 72 by 59. To figure the horizontal ring spacing, so we have columns of rings and rows across. So to figure the rows across, you'll subtract 4 inches for those 2-inch side hems on each side from your finished width and divide by 10. 10 is a good average number for a rib Roman shade. You can go over 10. It'll still lift great because it's got that stability of the ribs and the shade. So you can round up or round down. So for my class project was 64 minus 4, 60 divided by 10, bam. I need 6 columns, which means I'll have 7 columns of rings and cord shroud. And there's a graphic in your handout, which looks like this. So you can see from the top of the bottom hem going up, it's spaced 6 3/4 inches. And then my cord shroud and rings and lift lines will be 10 inches apart across the back of the shade. So let's talk about pattern matching because we're working on a large shade. And you're going to have a seam in there. And for my shade, I had a bouquet in the middle and I was able to put a half on each side. So I have a seam on each side. That's ideal. And that's what we usually shoot for, is to have a hole in the middle and a half on each side. But that's not always the case. It's not the standard because it depends on your fabric. So the graphic at the top left is an example of a fabric where you can split one and put a half on each side. You may have to have a seam in the middle. And I know it makes me cringe. I hate that, but the motif determines where your seam is going to be. So on the graphic in the center, if this was a fabric that had a huge zebras and they're going up the fabric at a stair step, you would have to have a seam in the middle of the shade. I also will sometimes put a seam in the middle of a shade if it's a sheer shade and there's wall behind the center so that the seam isn't having light shining from behind it. So sometimes you might have a seam in the center. Sometimes you might only have one seam on your shade, and that would be for maybe a drop match or a motif that is off center, like the example I have on the right. If you have two shades, maybe you can make a pair with one with a seam on the left and one with a seam on the right, or make them all the same. So anything goes, as long as you do a really nice pattern match, it's okay. And I like to use a method for seaming the cuts together that you can press flat so that it lays nice and flat and it's not lumpy. So I'm not going to serge a seam. I'm not going to use adhesives. I want to press that seam open. So here's the fabric. Beautiful, isn't it? The classic design from Caltan and Tau. And there's going to be a whole piece and a half piece on each side. And I forgot to mention on the last slide, if you're doing a solid color fabric and your shade is close to the finished width of your fabric and you're only going to need a seam like close to the edge, go ahead and cut down that center piece. And that might be a stripe or a solid or a small print. And plan your seam or seams to be where there's be a lift line. So for my shade, it'd be 12 inches in from the edge. I'd want a seam. So sort of think about that if you can cut down the center piece, because you don't want a seam like 1 inch from the edge. So I've split one hole in half. I'm putting a half on each side. I'm going to bring the fabric over face to face and find where the pattern match is. I only have a little bit showing of the pattern motif, about 1/4 inch. Sometimes you have more. I like it when it's a little bit more, but it worked out okay. And then I'm going to iron that same amount all the way down this half piece that I'm going to be pattern matching to the whole piece. So once you determine how far in you need to be, then you can go ahead and press it all the way down and make a nice crease. Now with that face down, you're going to start lining up your pattern. So you have to look for it, look for it, look for it. There it is. Sometimes it's hard to see. Okay, so I'm lining up those branches and leaves face to face. And stabbing a pin right in that crease that I pressed. And then go down and find it again. And notice the fabric on top grew a little bit when I ironed it. It's okay. We'll be able to compensate for that when we're sewing. I enjoy pattern matching. It's sort of like a puzzle, I guess. It's kind of fun to do, but it's time consuming doing it this way. But this will give me a nice flat seam for the Roman shade. And then I'm going to pick up the fabric underneath with that pen and bring the point of the pen out behind that selvage edge. So you want that selvage on top to be free so you can fold it back over. And add extra pens. If you find that the fabric is growing a little bit from pen to pen, add extra pens. So we're working to the pattern. So you're stabbing down into the crease, just into the edge of that crease, and rocking that up so that the point is behind the selvage. And I'm going to pin that all the way down. And you will have that nice crease line. So you need to have that pressed in crease line because that's where you're going to sew. That's your guide for sewing. That one's it's really close to the edge there, which is frustrating. Now there's lots of different pattern matching methods, from using fusible tapes to taking it like this and just going and sewing it on the sewing machine with the selvage pressed over, but that doesn't give you that flat open seam on the back. So I'm going to turn that over and sew right in that crease line. I'm sewing over pins. I do that, it's okay, but you can take the pins out if you want to. Just take your time. And the little bit of the pin that's showing, where you pin through, that's your guide, and your crease line is your guide. And every once in a while, you can fold it back and look at it if you think it's shifted. And for this fabric, the selvage edges are pretty even, lined up together, but every fabric's different. And I have the stitch length probably set about 3. You see I slowed down when I got to a pen there. And if you get to an area where you feel like it's growing or the fabric on top is moving forward, put a little tension between the front and the back with your left hand and right hand, and then sew from pen to pen. And that's keeping your pattern. If you take your pen out and let the fabric move forward, your match gets off. I have the sound off so you can't hear the clunk, 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 clunk of the sewing machine. And just working that all the way down to the bottom. So my cut there wasn't straight across because of the pattern matching. And take out all your pens so you don't accidentally cut over a pen. So I'll have to do that twice, one on each side. I have a whole piece in the center and the half piece on each side. And then trim the selvage to about a 1/2 inch. And there's pattern match. So now's your time to fix it. If it got off or you went over too far and the white from the selvage is showing. On Roman shades, it's a flat piece of fabric. So it won't be disguised like you can do with a drapery where you're putting the seam, to the back of a pleat. And then press your seam open nice and flat from the front and back. And now we're ready to cut the sleeves for the Roman shade ribs and the blackout lining and the inner line. The size that you cut the sleeves for your Roman shade ribs depends on the ribs you're using. I'm using plastic ribs, and you might be using fiberglass or metal ribs, which are much smaller. So I'm cutting the strips 1.5 inches. And I folded the fabric over. I have a big waist piece, a big scrap left over from something. Anyway, I'm using that. I like using blackout lining because it doesn't fray. You can certainly use something else, but then you have all those frayed edges. Blackout lining, perfect. And when I sew into it, you're not going to see the pinholes of light because the other blackout will be over this. I need 7 sleeves for my ribs. I have 7 ribs. And it's just a matter of measuring and cutting. If you have a rotary cutter and mat, this would be a very fast and efficient way to cut those out. Someone had asked if you could use the Dufix rib tape. I think you possibly could. I have not tried that. And it's a little bit larger than what I would need. My rib sleeves are, when I fold them over, only going to be 3/4 of an inch. So it depends on the size of the ribs, but it's possible. I just haven't made a sample with that. For wide width shades where you need to join the blackout lining, I like to use Jules tape that overlap the fabric, not sewing a seam, or Dufix Borton Fix tape. So you're just bringing the edges of the blackout together and overlapping them. I don't do that on draperies because it's free hanging and it's not as big of a deal, but on a Roman shade, if you sewed a seam together on blackout, you would see a line of light coming through. So using one of those adhesive products works great. The rib sleeves, I'm cutting them wide enough for the finished width of my shade, plus a little extra. I'm not trying to make them perfect. For the blackout lining, it's the finished width by finished length plus 2 inches, or just railroad it. That's what I'm doing. I don't have to worry about seaming it together and overlapping with the Jules tape. So I don't have to cut that finished length. I can trim away the excess later. The heavy flannel inner lining, I'm cutting it the same size as the blackout lining. And I will cut on the inside of the line or a little less than the finished width because you don't want it butting up tight. So a little breathing room is good. So 1/8 of an inch less than the finished width is fine. And I'm going to fold up the lining and inner lining and set that aside for a moment. And I'm using Payne's Out Black Serenity, which is the polyester substrate blackout lining. I also like the Hanes Cotton Out Black blackout lining. Now that everything's cut, I can go ahead and make the sleeves for the Roman shade ribs. I'm folding the 1 3/4 inch strips over and sewing a 1/4 inch seam. I have markings on the feed dog plate, or you can line it up with the side of the toe on your machine foot, maybe, depending on your machine foot. And just sew that with the right side of the blackout out. The right side of the blackout is the woven side. Blackout has a suede side and a woven side. The suede side is made with acrylic foam layers It's a white layer, a black layer, and a white layer. And that's applied onto a substrate, which is a woven cloth. So I want the woven side out as that's the right side. And the reason being, I mean, really, blackout performs the same way, no matter which way it's facing. But with the rib sleeves, I might be ironing over this later. So I'll have the blackout lining over the ribs. I'll be ironing, and I don't want to create black marks because you can iron away that acrylic foam layer. So make sure that the foam layer is on the inside of the rod pocket. And I'm sewing them all in a row. I'm not stopping to clip between each piece. It's really easy to do. You could have a helper sew these for you. It's sort of production work. And then I'm bringing in another piece and starting that. I have the face fabric ready, so that was cut. It's matched, seams pressed open. And I'm putting that out on the work table. I'm using the work table grid and also the edges of the work table to make sure everything stays nice and square. I'm turning over the side hems. You want to do your side hems first on a Roman shade. And I have a 4-inch allowance for side hems. So I'm going to fold it over and sort of press it with the edge of the wooden ruler. I'm going to double check the finished width. I'm not going to rely on just folding over 4 inches because of the take up of the cloth. You might need a little less than 4 inches. It just depends. So I'm just sort of using the edge of the ruler to just scrape that in place and to hold the fabric in place. And then I'll double check the measurement before I press that side hem. Because this is a linen fabric, I don't want to have a crease in the wrong place. Lisa's asking if the clippers on my sewing machine are attached with a cord. Yes, they are tied off on a leash on the sewing machine. And if you do that, make sure that your cord isn't too long, because if they fall off, you don't want them hitting the floor. So it's like bungee jumping, right? If they bungee jump off the sewing machine, then they're not going to hit the hard floor. So you want your leash long enough to come over to clip, but not so long that when it falls off the machine, it hits the floor. So you can see I have the big ruler out, double checking the width. And I am not taking an inside mount allowance because I'm adding layers. I'm adding inner lining, blackout lining, and ribs. And when you add layers, things tend to get a little smaller. So the thicker your drapery, the thicker your Roman shade, the smaller it will sort of pull in. You could absolutely make an allowance on the width if you wanted to do that, a deduction for inside mounting. All of this part of the process, the measuring, the width, and when we start adding the sleeves for the ribs, all that placement, I spend a lot of time on that, making sure that's accurate and right. I work really deliberately and slowly. So this is my normal speed, and it takes a little while. And you might be wondering why I'm measuring everything when I have the gridded work table. Well, the gridded work table is fantastic, and I would not have a work table without it. But it is fabric, and over time it can get skewed or stretch or shrink, especially in areas that you work a lot, because we have a sweet spot that we always go to. And if you're ironing there a lot, your table grid might get shifted a little bit. So I always measure. I don't rely on just the table grid. And then folding under the cut edge to create the doubled side hem. Don't get too aggressive with your ironing. I'm sort of patting that. I don't want to iron like this because I might stretch it. I want to keep it nice and square and straight. If your side hem ends up 2 1/8 inches or 1 7/8 inches, it's okay. I don't even measure them. I'm just folding them over and they end up what they are. It's fine. They're around 2 inches. Now I can add the inner lining. So that was cut the finish width minus a hair. And that's going to go underneath the side hems and even with the top edge. So where I'm standing right now in the video is the top of the shade. And you don't want it too big. You don't want it crammed into the side hems. You don't want wrinkles or fullness. It has to lay nice and flat. I'm using the ruler again to sort of smooth that out as I go. And because this was railroaded, I'm going to have a little extra, and I'll trim that away after I fold up the bottom hem. Now I can put that inner lining under the side hems. I had someone recently say, because of where they lived, they lived in a hot environment, hot all year. And she said, I would never use inner lining. I don't need a class that shows inner lining. But inner lining isn't just for cold climates. It helps to enhance the face fabric and makes it look better. And in this case, it helps to hide all those ribs and rib sleeves from showing. So it really doesn't take that long to add that one extra layer, and it adds a lot to the shade. So now I'm working on the finished length from the top. And as I mentioned earlier, there's no extra allowance. The top of the shade is going to be at the top of the head rail on the back with Velcro. So there's no extra at the top. And I could put a pen in there to have something to push that ruler against instead of walking around the table. I could have put 3 pens and then put the ruler up against there. That would have been more efficient. I'm not always efficient. And again, pressing that hem so that I don't skew it by ironing aggressively, steaming by pressing and not ironing, but pressing. Just lightly pressing and ironing. And there's the double hem. And now I'm going to check that. I had the hem allowance when I cut the fabric to size, but I want to make sure the finished length has to be the finished length. So if the hem, if I need to trim some off or not, I'm measuring that just to double check. And sometimes, if you're pattern matching or something, you might have excess fabric that you need to trim away. But you do want to make sure with a pattern motif like this that your design is where you want it to be. So for this fabric, I wanted to make sure that bouquet was centered on the shade. Sometimes if a shade's going to be up all the time, I want the bouquet or maybe something to be featured at the top. So you have to pre-plan that when you cut out your finished size of the shade. So I'm trimming away the excess interlining because it was railroaded. You can see the selvage there. And then turning up for a doubled bottom hem. And that bottom hem is going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 3.375. But that's where we're going to start measuring our folds, the ring spacing from the top of the bottom hem. If you are making a shade that has trim or banding, or you want a reveal of your hem, you need to take that out of your calculations when you're figuring your ring spacing so that you have excess at the bottom. But I didn't plan that. I don't have any trim or anything on this. And I have a question. Jessica says she has learned her lesson about ironing linen, that you want to press it because ironing it can be a problem. So when you joined me earlier today, this is where we left off. So hopefully the recording will work from now on. The video will not go away this time. I'm taking one rib sleeve, placing it under the top edge of the bottom hem. The stitching is going towards the top of the shade. And it's okay. I cut the fabric bigger than it needed to be. So I'm putting that sleeve right under the hem, even with the stitching. And the little seam, the little 1/4 inch seam allowance is going up to the top of the shade. And then trim it off about 1/8 of an inch less than the finished width. So that the top of the hem is going to be on top of the rib underneath. That's the plan. So that pocket where the rib's going to be inserted will be underneath the top edge of the hem. I'm just going to stab some pins in to hold that in place. Now I need to do the next piece. So grab the next one. And just keep going with the rib sleeves. I like calling them sleeves. I think pockets is a little confusing because that would mean I actually have in my book a blackout method where rib pockets are sewn in the inner lining. And then you put the ribs in. So you're making pockets in the inner lining, putting the inner lining in place. And that's really time consuming. And it's harder to get accurate spacing than with this method. But I didn't know this method when I wrote my book in 2016. So we are always learning. But that method works too. It makes a beautiful shade. And I'm measuring from the stitch line to the stitch line on the next piece. So don't get confused and measure from the stitch line to the bottom of the sleeve. And then on the next one to the stitching or something, you got to be consistent. Wherever you measure from, you're going to measure the same all the way up. So because the stitch line was above the edge of the bottom hem, I'm measuring from the stitch line to the next sleeve with the small seam allowance facing up, and then just pinning them in place. You could draw lines on your blackout lining. It would be faster than what I'm doing. Go ahead and draw lines, the blackout will cover it. You can use chalk or a pencil and just lay your sleeves out where they need to be. You could use a laser level, put that laser line right across there and line up the sleeve. So there's much more efficient methods than what I'm showing you, because I'm going to spend a lot of time making sure that this is accurate. But the time spent doing this is absorbed in the overall fabrication of the shade. And when you go to sew your rings on, you don't have to remeasure all this again. So it's already done for you. So it was 6 3/4 inches from the stitch line to the stitch line. With the end of that rib sleeve about 1/8 of an inch from the outside edge. So I have 7 of these to put in place. So let's speed that up. So we're not sitting here all day watching me do this. And sometimes, you might look at it and go, that was a little wonky. So I got my big ruler out, make sure it was straight. And it might be easier to insert the rib in the casing or in the sleeve before you do this step, because it would be rigid. It'd be easier to lay in place. So that is one of the notes at the end of your handout, is you might want to try putting the ribs in the sleeves and then putting them in place. Either way works great. So there's some efficiency things there. Drawing lines would be more efficient. Putting the ribs in and laying it on the lines, that would be a lot faster than the way I'm doing it. So now I'm marking the vertical columns of cord, shroud, and rings. So I have one on the outside of to the inside of the side hem, and then 10 inches in between. So I'm just drawing a line. It's not going to show. I'm stabbing some pins in and keeping it in place. And actually I have 2 rulers. I can go 10 inches over from one ruler to the other ruler and draw that line. And double checking again. Because I wasn't happy with it. So I'm going and double checking again. And then continue marking. So now's the time to check, check your spacing, because once you sew it all on and put your blackout lining on, you can't go back and change that. So you want to make sure it's right. So I'm just stabbing pins in at each mark where I'll be sewing the rib sleeve to the face fabric. So at each pin or each mark, I'm going to sew with a double thread. I'm using Coats hand quilting thread. You could also use the Turco satin thread. And I'm sewing like I'd be sewing on a shade ring and giving a nice knot on there. I'm using a thread that matches the face fabric. You're sewing all the way through. And you're sewing in that 1/4 inch seam allowance. So you're making a generous stitch, and it's okay to have a nice big knot on the back. It's not going to show. So I'm catching the face fabric and then making a knot. If you like to sew on your shade rings by using one long piece and threading it all the way through and then cutting it and tying it, you can do that too. I'm very awkward doing that. I'm not very good at it. So now it's just a matter of doing all these tack points and the seam allowance of the blackout. If you need to move the shade around, pin it perpendicular to the rib sleeve, and then you can move it around on the work table. I'm not a fan of climbing on the work table to sew things. I end up just scooting it around with my knees and messing it all up. So I prefer to move the project. And with this method, it's really easy just to pin those sleeves and move it towards you and keep sewing. And that's what it looks like. You're just sewing a nice generous stitch, catching the top of the rib pocket, and that seam is facing to the top of the shade. I'm adding woven buckram to the hem. You don't have to do that. This is optional. I like to do this sometimes. And in something like a linen, I want to make sure that it stays nice and square. You could use a fusible woven or non-fusible. And because this is a woven buckram, it's easy to rip down. So my hem is not 4 inches and the buckram is. So I need to cut off a little bit. So I'm just measuring that, and then I'll tear away the excess. Can't do that on non-woven. And then just tuck that into the bottom hem.
Underneath.
I go under the side hem. And now I can put the ribs in. And they're a little, you want the pockets to be a little tight, not too tight to get the rib in, but you want them a little tight. And on a wide shade like this, it would have been better to put them in beforehand, I think. I get a little jammed up on this one, but I'll show you how to fix it. So I'm trying to get that across, and I get a little jammed up. And the way to fix that is to insert a rib from the other end. So instead of struggling with it, I'm just going to put a rib in the other end, and it sort of opens up the pocket there so I can shove it over. I actually bought boning. If you've ever done costumes or garment sewing, you can buy boning that's in a sleeve already. It didn't work for Roman shade. It didn't work for this method. I thought it would be a time saver, but it didn't work. The ribs are cut 1.5 inches less than the finished width so that the side hem can stay nice and flat. You want it to be wide enough to be included where that stitching is on the outside edge. And now I'm going to cover the weight bar. I'm using threaded rod, which is very affordable and easy to buy and find. And it's 3/8 inch threaded rod, but threaded rod can discolor, can rust. Even the galvanized threaded rod, I don't trust it without being covered. So sometimes I'll tape it with tape over it, but I'm using blackout lining. It'll make a really nice, clean Roman shade weight bar. You can use a flat weight bar whatever you want to use is fine. So I'm using Jules tape, which is a double-sided sticky tape, 1/4 inch size on each side of that strip, which is cut 2 inches by the length of the weight bar and a little bit extra, about a 1/2 inch extra. And then put the weight bar on the sticky tape. And roll that over to create a good looking weight bar, which nobody will ever see, but we know that it looks nice. And then at the end, you could trim that off, or I just shove that in. You don't have to worry about it because the weight bar is cut less than the finished width. So that's not going to jam up in there. Okay, that was perfect 1 hour class. The last class that I tried to record was going quite long because I was having so many technical issues. So let me check the messages, the questions. Where do you buy Roman shade ribs? I buy them from Rolly Company or from Textile Industries, which is their textiles. It's confusing, but their website is draperysupplies.com. And I use the plastic ribs. I like those because they're so easy to cut. You know, fiberglass ribs, you've got the little fiberglass fibers, but the fiberglass ribs are more rigid. But because we're sewing in these sleeves, the ribs are not going to bend or anything. They're going to be, you know, on those sleeves, which are sewn at a certain space. So they work fine. Do you put a rib in the sleeve tucked into the fold? I think you mean the bottom hem, the one under the bottom hem. Yes, absolutely. So there's 7 rib sleeves and there's a rib in each one. Yes. And if you have any questions this week, I'm happy to, that I just clicked on the messages and the video went away again. So I'm going to have to discover what's up with that. It says I'm using enhanced encryption. Okay. Sorry, folks. The weight bar, where did it go? I haven't put the weight bar in yet. So I ended this class with making the weight bar, but I haven't put it in yet. So you have to see that next week. Okay. So I hope that you enjoyed the class today, and I will have the recording. Let's see. The buckram was in the bottom hem. Yes. I'm having the same issue again. I'm sorry to be fiddling with this, but I'm having the same issue with the clicking on the questions and the video goes away. But thank goodness it's the end of the class this time. So you're welcome. And yes, the buckram was on the bottom hem only. It's optional. You don't have to put buckram in the bottom hem. You can just fold up to have the double fold. But because this was linen, I wanted to have a little extra something to make sure it stayed square. That's all. So thank you so much for your patience with me today as I worked out these technical issues, and I will be sending you a link to view the recording as soon as it's uploaded. So thank you so much, everyone. Have a great day, and I'll see you next week.